Great. Thank you, Mayor. Appreciate the opportunity. We continue to work with a great sense of urgency, of course. But as I mentioned last week, treating this as a marathon now, and really wanting to continue that sense of urgency, but also pace ourselves to ensure that we can continue to serve the community in a meaningful way. Certainly, we're working on the COVID front. As you all know, we're working on the budget front. And just a brief update, we still have not published the proposed budget yet. The team is continuing to work extremely hard. We do anticipate being able to do that this afternoon and then preserve the remainder of the budget schedule. And then also, I think you're seeing the fact that our other essential services are there's somewhat of a pent-up demand to move certain things forward, and we're needing to do that to keep our other lines of business moving and operating. And so just a lot going on. So I want to start off our unsung heroes with one of those items, the Community Energy Department heroes. And certainly, while the public's focus has been mostly on our COVID response, as I said, there's many other essential city operations that are going on every day. And the Community Energy Department has worked really hard to ensure seamless electricity generation during all the stay-at-home orders. All the staff are at home working from home. To that end, the department recently signed 2 new power purchase agreements that will bring enough solar energy to power nearly 79,000 homes. And I want to thank the Community Energy Department for all their hard work and leadership and just keeping the lights on, if you will, as we go through this unusual time frame. And then there's actually 3 employees I want to recognize from different places in the organization and representing different work that's going on. The first is Nancy Macias from the Library Department. She's a public information representative with the library. Nancy and others have worked tirelessly to communicate library resources to the public during the closure because there are many of those library services can be accessed. And Nancy oversees newsletters, social media, and creates content for weekly updates in English and Spanish. Nancy's also lending her media relations talents to the emergency PIO functions in the EOC. So thank you, Nancy. The second employee is Greg Twilliger from Public Works. Greg is a senior electrician in that department, and certainly his prior experience working in emergencies has been a tremendous resource for the department. And he has helped develop safety procedures and work plans to keep critical infrastructure going at a time where we can't operate in a normal function and we're having to make all these adjustments. So just want to thank Greg for his creativity and designing procedures that will keep our employees safe. And then finally, I would like to recognize Felicita Nichols in PRNS. Felicita is a youth intervention worker working with Youth Intervention's female intervention team. Due to COVID-19, she can't spend time working with young women that she's responsible for working with. However, she has taken an outside-the-box approach to her work by incorporating Zoom for her curriculum and DJ sets and writing prompts and other means of connecting virtually with participants. So just fantastic work. And so just want to thank all of our employees for continuing their dedication and creativity during these times. Want to just highlight that we notified you all yesterday, the Silicon Valley Strong Grant Program for San Jose small businesses launched yesterday. The program is being administered by our partner Opportunity Fund and is funded by generous donors. It will provide working capital grants of $10,000 to eligible small businesses in San Jose that have suffered financial losses due to COVID. Grants can be used to cover costs such as employee payroll and 2 weeks sick leave, paid sick leave, rent and utilities, outstanding debts to vendors, and other operating costs. Anticipate 142 grants will be awarded. and applications close this Sunday, March 17th at 11:59. The administration is working with the Opportunity Fund on an additional small business loan program, which is funded with $2.5 million in CDBG grants. Next, I want to just notify the council. Last week, we received a letter from the county, a call for contact tracing staff. And so the county is expanding its infrastructure for case investigation and contact tracing. And they're looking for 700 contact tracers. This same letter went to, I think, every jurisdiction in the county. I just want to link this to item number 2 in the mayor's back to work memo. And so we are evaluating our own capacity. There's some criteria for the tracers, and there's some time frame commitments for the tracers that we're looking at. But certainly, I think it's in all of our best interest to be able to support the county in this effort as we try to get everyone back to work and back to their lives. So that does it for my piece of this. I'm going to hand it over to the team, where you're going to hear from Kip providing some information, and I think some of this came out of some of the questions from last week around data and patterns and insight and kind of where we're going. And then Lee is going to head up a discussion on recovery, where you'll hear from Ray and Lee and Luce and Benna and Jim Shannon talking about certainly the waterfall when it comes to some of the recovery dollars and how we're going to propose to use them and what that means for us as a city. So I'm going to ask Lee to start us off.
Thank you, Dave. And on behalf of Kip Harkness and I've been our Emergency Operations Center Director for the last week, and I will be kicking us off. Next slide. While most of our presentations have focused on our outputs for the city roadmap for the COVID-19 crisis, today we'll be presenting on 2 different topics, as Dave mentioned, a little bit more of a narrower focus. Really an update on the data and insights for the crisis and the importance of compliance with the public health order and where we are today with that, which Kip will be walking through. And then, as Dave mentioned, we're going to focus on roadmap item number 7, which is really our initial funding strategy, our cost recovery strategies, as well as the work that we're putting in and where we are at with an official source and use statement for our overall response and recovery process related to COVID-19. So that is the agenda, and I'm going to hand it over to Kip to walk through our first section of the presentation.
Thank you, Lee. Kip Harkness, Deputy City Manager and incoming Director of the Emergency Operations Center. I did want to take a moment to walk us through some of what we know now about COVID-19, the trajectory and the arc of this disease. And I use as our starting point this notion that Sri Shivananda taught me when he was CTO at PayPal. Data by itself is meaningless, but from data we can begin to see patterns. From patterns we can derive insights, and from insights we can drive action. And that's how we've been working throughout this crisis, is to seek to use data to see those patterns, to derive insights, and to drive action. So I go back to some of the initial work that we did very early on. And the good news is that the initial insights that we had hold true, which is when we did our initial modeling, we found that the cases at the county-wide level are far greater than our testing capacity was indicating. We understood how important it was to rapidly slow down the spread of the disease to make sure that we do not run out of hospital capacity, and that the biggest thing we could do to flatten that curve was ensure compliance with the public health order in order to save lives. All 3 of those insights which drove our action continue to be true, even as we've learned more about the disease and actually have real numbers rather than projections to go off of. So I want to share a little bit of the projections and the actual numbers now that we have from the county that they've shared in some recent presentations, and let you know what we think of us. So this graph produced by the county shows at a high level the number of cases both in Santa Clara County and, by comparison, the state of California as a whole. What you see here tells us that Santa Clara County is actually tracking in line with deaths per capita throughout California. That may not sound like much, but this is actually a pretty incredible achievement, given that COVID-19 was here in Santa Clara County first. So we had the least time to prepare and should have had the highest and steepest ramp up in the entire state. We didn't. We've kept it flat, and we've kept it flat relative to other places which have much less dense population and population centers that are at less risk than ours. For example, deaths per capita in Los Angeles County are more than twice the rate of California overall, whereas we've been able to stay at the rate of California overall. So another look at that same number is the county's public-facing COVID-19 dashboard. And what this shows is that we are flattening the curve and our trajectory is encouraging. New cases per day are declining, realizing that the last 5 days, that data comes in slowly, so the last 5 days will be a little higher than what's displayed here. But they are declining, and they have been for some time. And what that means is we are, as they say, flattening the curve. What is the result of this? Well, according to the county's own modeling, the estimate is that as we near the 60-day mark, we collectively have taken action as a community that has saved more than 8,400 lives. That's pretty incredible. It is an odd space to be in because it's what has not happened that has been most important, and it's sometimes hard to feel that in the same way that we feel the things that have happened, such as the economic stress that has been caused by the shelter in place and all of the other effects. But I think it is very important to note that the collective action of individuals across this city has been instrumental in saving literally thousands of lives in the last several weeks. However, we have had deaths, and those deaths have been disproportionate in terms of affecting our most vulnerable communities. This picture in this chart brought from the Mercury News shows very clearly that the deaths are falling disproportionately on the east side, and that about a third of the first 100 deaths in Santa Clara County are estimated to have occurred in just 4 zip codes, all of them in East San Jose. The rate of death in the poorer areas is 4 times higher than that of wealthy areas. And most notably, the areas with Latino populations are bearing the brunt of the impact, with about 34% of the deaths in the Latino community, who represent only about 23% of the 18 and older population. All of this makes it clear that as we prepare for recovery, it is extremely important that we do this carefully to make sure that we do not exacerbate the conditions that are impacting our most vulnerable communities, and that we come out of this in a way that has those communities at the heart of our work. So what do we see? What's in the proverbial crystal ball? Well, there are a lot of different possible futures, and we actually don't know what shape the pandemic will take. There's a lot of uncertainty about the disease. We don't know to what extent it will, like other coronaviruses, slow down and almost disappear over the summer or not, and whether, like other coronaviruses, it'll come back in the fall and winter. We don't know to what extent immunity is conferred by having had COVID-19 to future strains of COVID-19. But we do know the path forward is going to be long and hard. Because we have done so well at preventing the deaths, it means we have a lot of our people in the community, the vast majority in the community, who have not been exposed to the disease. And so that means that when we come out of the place, that everybody who has not had the disease is once again at risk. And so until there's a vaccine, until it is scaled up, we are going to be in this in some form or another. And so we must prepare for the possibility of a resurgence and build the testing, tracing, and supported isolation capacity at the county level to be able to understand when that resurgence is coming. As an example here, we've included some of the charts of the deaths of the 1918 pandemic to show you how, in this case, it actually had 3 waves, the first of which was the most mild. There was some mutation in the flu, and the second wave was the most deadly, but that was followed by a third wave, which was also very significant and deadly. We don't know if this is a pattern that COVID will follow. This is similar to the pattern that other flu pandemics have followed, but it is very likely that if we come out of the shelter in place without maintaining protections, that we will see a rapid increase in the number of deaths and lose the ground that we have gained. So all of this is to say that we are still in this. This is a marathon, or as Lee and I like to say, a triathlon. It's a multi-sport event, some of which we're learning as we go, but it will require all of us to continue and to endure. I think, and as Dr. Cody is quoted here as saying, it is only going to get harder. I think the positive note that I would end on is I believe we are capable of making it through this. Everything that I've seen about our organization has demonstrated to me that to a person, we will respond and we will do what we can to mitigate the spread of this disease. And I believe we are going to make it out, and we are going to make it out together. But it is not something that we're going to switch a light switch on and be done with. It is something we are going to work together through this triathlon, through this marathon, over a long, difficult haul. With that, I will turn it back to Lee to walk through a little bit of our approach to some of the financing and funding aspects of this long haul recovery. Thank you.
Thanks, Kip. And can you go to the next slide for me? Thanks. So as Dave mentioned, several of us are going to be presenting to you, and just want to note Jim Shannon's name is here, but I will be trying to present his slides to the best of my ability today so that he can focus on the overall proposed budget for the city. Recovery means a lot of different things in the emergency management world. However, we are going to focus a little bit on, previous slide, Kip. We are going to focus today on our financial and our fiscal recovery based off of questions last week. And this will include how financial recovery typically works. And given that this event is very different than previous events, our strategy for moving forward with an overall fiscal structure in place for this response. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our Director of Emergency Management, Ray Reardon. And you can go to the next slide, Kip.
Thank you, Lee. Good morning. I'm Ray Reardon, the Director of the City Manager's Office of Emergency Management. I'm also the Planning Section Coordinator in the Emergency Operations Center. As we begin to discuss financial recovery, we need to understand how it relates to the response, when activities take place and when the funding resources are available. Today, I'm going to talk to you from my 34 years experience responding to 15 presidential emergencies and recovering from over 12 of those. I'd like to describe what I will call a typical response to a presidentially declared emergency. It's important to understand you can have emergencies that are not declared by the president, and that's a different process. I'll be focusing on the presidential declared emergencies. When an event happens, like the Coyote Creek 2017 flood, the city of San Jose deployed resources to respond to the presented conditions with an effort to provide the best services and address the community-facing issues like evacuation and sheltering. So that's represented in the boxes to the left of the arrow response in that effort. When we transitioned from response to recovery, it took place after the emergency was stabilized. Inspectors conducted an initial damage estimate, and then state and federal inspectors followed us to confirm what the initial damage estimate identified. This all starts with the termination of the emergency, which is a date set by the state, which signals time to begin the recovery process. About 6 months after the flood, the city submitted project worksheets. So let's start to move into the green boxes to the right. We submitted the project worksheets around the standardized 8 reimbursement categories from FEMA. After we submitted the project worksheets, state and federal recovery specialists scrutinized the worksheets to make sure that the justifications were correct and the documentation was complete. As work progresses, then the city provides progress reports to the state and the federal recovery specialists through a web portal. Sometimes we get caught in a cycle of denials from the state and federal specialists, and we respond to requests for information to add more data. And other times we may receive a denial and then start an appeal process. Once all the questions are addressed, funds are released after another review of documentation. For the 2017 Coyote Creek flood, we continue to get reimbursement funds. And this can stretch out for another year or two as we continue with the reimbursement process. The funding and reimbursement process is managed at the staff level, and reports to council presented twice a year. With response to the PG&E power shutoffs, the process was similar. However, there was no presidential declaration. We responded to the emergency, recovered shortly after the 2 outages, And we did submit the initial damage assessment to the state and the county. But without that presidential declaration, the state assumed the recovery support by providing us a $500,000 grant directly with a very simple application process. We currently have those funds to do planning and mitigation work prior to the next BPS. We were able to work in short order as the response was complete and we could focus specific people on the recovery efforts. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. COVID-19 presented the most impactful emergency local, state, federal, and global responders have ever seen. With this unprecedented emergency, the old way of response to recovery was modified. You can see with the two parallel lines that the collective we initiated recovery during the recovery, local, state, and federal assets all together. The state and federal agencies offered assistance early in the process, which was new, the first time in California this has been offered. FEMA even created an opportunity for expediting applications for funds. While the direction to allow for reimbursement of congregate and non-congregate care and food were issued, the detailed rules were being developed as they were offered during for these expedited applications. The guidance continues to evolve. We do know that the two expedited packages we submitted have been thoroughly reviewed and we expect approval this week. That's 2 weeks after we submitted. That's record time. In order to keep the funds, however, we got to make sure our documentation is well prepared for any future audit. And the approval is only for the eligible projects for which we have the authority to provide. We recognize there are other federal funding streams beyond FEMA and additional packages are being developed, which Benna will cover later in the presentation. The challenge has been in understanding what different eligible activities qualify for the various funds. And Luz will cover that in her presentation. The shift to this front-loading recovery of resources has caused some uncertainty because not all the federal packages will follow the FEMA rules. As a result, we may have a lot of documentation to clean up later when more details of the guidance for each stream becomes more clear. We must also be prepared for any spike and any recovery, and all the recovery will take time. As Kip mentioned, we'll respond as we can while returning to business in a safe manner. Back to you, Lee.
Thank you, Ray. And, I just wanted to thank Ray and his leadership during this crisis. Tuesdays are a very busy day in the EOC as we do transitions, and he is responsible for kind of converting our emergency action plan from week to week on Tuesdays. So he's been very focused on Tuesdays, and we haven't pulled him in. But your dedication and steadfast approach to ensuring that we've all been doing our training the past 2 years and ensuring that the EOC runs an appropriate way has been really important. So thank you, Ray.
Thank you.
As presented 2 weeks ago, our financial recovery will be guided by 3 approaches. And do the recovery right. So this is continuing to focus on the most vulnerable and at-risk populations through this event. Second, maximizing our reimbursement potential. So we will be maximizing our reimbursement potential by strategically matching the highest and best funding sources to the highest and best eligible uses. And Luz will go into this in a second. And then lastly, and most importantly, minimize the general fund impact. With the economic crisis, while the economic crisis does affect all of our funds, as we focus on our at-risk and most vulnerable populations, the most powerful tool that we have is our city staff and our general fund to then support that community. Therefore, as we work together to recover from COVID-19, we'll use as many non-general fund resources, federal and state resources as appropriate. I'm going to hand it over to Luz, and where the rest of the presentation is going to focus on number 2 and number 3 and how we're starting to do this initial work. Luz, over to you. Next slide.
Good morning, Mayor, Council members. You've already seen this waterfall graphic that demonstrates at a very high level how the city intends to apply various funding sources to COVID-19 related expenditures. As we said the last time you saw this waterfall approach first uses the most restricted funds, such as FEMA, then taps into monies that are less restrictive, such as the coronavirus relief funds, or CRF. Finally and last, and in this case we are emphasizing the very least to be used, our city funding sources, which includes the general fund. I will share with you that Julia Cooper and I were on a nationwide call yesterday with about 150 other big cities and counties who were direct recipients of CRF funds and also received significant deposits into their respective accounts in the last couple of weeks. I will also share that we all seem to have the same mixed emotions about the CRF advance, both sheer glee and sheer terror, as the guidelines were and continue to be fairly vague.
Mhm.
Waterfall approach was also mentioned by others during that call as a path forward to use all available sources of funding in the most optimal manner. And we continue to work on a citywide strategic funding plan to best leverage all monies available to the city. Next slide, please. So this should also be a familiar graphic presented last week, which was presented last time. It provides insight of the most recently passed coronavirus relief package, which is CARES Act 3.0 in detail. The large purple bubble represents the entire CARES Act 3.0 program. This funding has proved to be very dynamic as individual federal agencies issue their notices of funding availability and opportunities to address their own particular priorities. Ever since last week, the city received, even since last week, the city received notice from the U.S. Department of Commerce of $1.5 billion in CARES Act funds to, quote, aid communities impacted by the coronavirus pandemic. Again, big. The city is directly eligible for this money, and the city's Office of Economic Development is reviewing the terms and conditions for accessing and applying for these funds. Next slide, please. So remember a few slides ago, Ray mentioned that the challenge has been in understanding what different eligible activities qualify. This illustrates just how challenging that analysis has become, given all the different funding sources with different eligibility and reporting requirements and all the different uses. Let's take, for example, the bubble on the right, the food and necessities bubble, and that's up towards the top on your right-hand side of the screen. That use, or at least a portion of that use of food and necessities, is eligible for FEMA public assistance, the FAA airport money, CRF money, and CDBG money. The hard part, the really, really hard part about this is making sure that we organize a citywide plan so we're getting the best bang for the buck and not duplicating benefits. That is, getting paid for the same use twice. Frankly, this is just as complicated as it looks. And now I'll turn it over to Lee to provide a broad overview of the initial COVID-19 use strategy.
Thanks, Luz. Last week, Council inquired about the structure of the CARES Act and the allocation of the $178 million to the city. And it's important to note the following, and I think we as staff have not done a good job. We've used different terminology to talk through this, and typically the word that's been used by staff and discussed with Council is the term reimbursement. And so I just want to kind of clarify three things so everyone is using the correct terminology, especially us, so that we can communicate clearly with the Council. Reimbursement only applies to the FEMA program. And so typically, as Ray said, that is, it's called reimbursement because it happens after the disaster and through the recovery process. In this case, FEMA has decided, given the scope of the crisis, to advance some of that money. But we use the term reimbursement to only actually speak about FEMA. The second is the CARES Act. And typically, I think a lot of people have assumed the CARES Act is what gave us the $178 million direct deposit from the department, or direct allocation from the Department of Treasury. And that is true, except the CARES Act is actually much larger. If you think about that bubble that Lou showed a few slides ago, the CARES Act is made up of several different things. It's the money we received through the CDBG program, the ESG, the FEMA public assistance, as well as the FAA support that the airport got. What also is included in the CARES Act is the Coronavirus Relief Fund, or what we refer to as CRF, and that is what gave us our direct allocation from the Department of Treasury. So we will be very crisp as we continue to talk through that with you. One of the requests from Council last week is to better understand what does the structure of the Coronavirus Relief Fund look like and how we intend to bring forward the allocations of the 178 million. And so really quickly, the Coronavirus Relief Fund is basically structured into two halves. And there's a response half and a recovery. And in the response, it talks about medical expenses that can be covered, as well as any public health compliance that needs to take place, as well as paying for our actual response and payroll expenses for that response, as well as facilitating compliance with the public health order. And then, quite frankly, it's fairly vague thus far and has little money in the current package around economic support and recovery planning, although it looks like a lot of that is taking shape in the next CARES Act, which Ben will speak to in a second. Next slide. And it's important to note as we start to look at this that we do not actually intend to ever have a discussion with the council on just the Coronavirus Relief Fund. It's important to note, given all of the other funding sources that Lou's referenced, as well as the evolving guidelines and the complexity of matching all of the sources, the administration believes that a discussion at a higher level, so a discussion around the COVID-19 source and use or overall budget, is a much better conversation and better maximizes our reimbursement potential and also better protects the general fund. This past week, the EOC, the Budget Office, and Finance Department have worked to put together rough estimates and develop a use strategy, not a source and use, but a use strategy that contemplates continuing operations through the end of the calendar year. This piece, along with the analysis that Luz and team are doing, will ultimately lead to the overall source and use in the coming weeks that we'll return to council on. I want to outline a few different things. So how we got to these numbers. I want to provide a kind of broad perspective here, and we arrived at these at a very high level by extrapolating where applicable to estimate expenses through the calendar year and look at burn rates or where we had additional or monthly burn rates or where we had additional information we were able to plug into this model. However, I do want to mention that at this point in time, these numbers assume that we continue to respond as we are responding through the end of the calendar year. As Kip mentioned, we don't yet know what's in store for us, and we don't yet know what we will scale down or what we will scale up, and what additional needs may come as the situation changes. Second, I want to talk about how these estimates are evolving. Obviously, the crisis continues to change. We will refine our numbers as we continue, as Ray mentioned, the documentation process to follow up and get additional detail. I do want to mention a few things on how these numbers will change as well. Luz did mention the package from FEMA earlier on in the presentation. So these numbers represent what's all in on the use side. It does not contemplate or take money out for what we have in for FEMA reimbursement thus far. So our initial request for FEMA reimbursement, or what we believe we will get for food distribution in the first 30 days, is $3.7 million. As well as on the PPE side, or and facility compliance, overall, we have a $2 million reimbursement request in for the first 30 days. So those will change these numbers as well. Also important to note that small business funding, very little money specifically earmarked for it in the CARES Act, or I'm sorry, the Coronavirus Relief Fund. However, Department of Commerce has just released $1.5 billion in funds, and we are cobbling together other funding sources and future packages to put money into that bucket for the long-term recovery. In addition, future funding potential around a CARES Act 4.0, as well as additional policy changes or revenue changes from FEMA could change these numbers as well. And then lastly, reimbursement from the county and city jurisdictions will draw down on these amounts as well. But as you can see, the overall budget and use strategy for this response is quite vast. And it's important that we have the conversation in totality and not just one funding pot at a time, because if we have that siloed policy and budget allocation conversation, it will take tools away from us to maximize that reimbursement and protect the general fund. To talk a little bit about future funding packages and how these numbers may be offset, I will turn it over to Benna Chang, our Director of Intergovernmental Relations.
Great. Morning, everybody. Next slide, please. So first, just wanted to remind council that this is a very complicated picture as we've been talking about this morning. We focused a lot this morning on how complicated it is for the city itself, but obviously we're working with many partners on the response side as well. And they all have their own individual funding sources and programs that they are uniquely qualified to compete for. So just as an example, we took a look on the screen about the various food distribution funding sources that are in the CARES Act and then also some state funding. You'll see here that some of the funding from the CARES Act around food went to some of our partners, or that our partners are better able to compete and qualify for, including Santa Clara County and the food banks. So we are working right now with those partners, including Second Harvest Food Bank, the County Office of Education, the county itself, to refine a comprehensive food funding strategy. And really, again, to help everyone maximize the funding sources. More funding to our region obviously benefits everybody. Next slide, please. So it's been a big morning this morning for IGR, a lot going on both at the federal and state levels in regards to additional recovery support. So the biggest news this morning is that the House Dems released their proposal for the fourth federal stimulus package just before 10 o'clock Pacific today. It's called the HEROES Act, and it is a big, big package. So the IGR team will be working throughout this week to do some more deeper analysis on the package. But so far, it looks very much like a CARES Act 2.0 or Part 2. There's a lot of funding in there for many of the things that the city cares about, including additional food support, SNAP, WIC, child nutrition programs, additional rental assistance, homelessness support, homeowners assistance. Very importantly for the city, there is a proposal from the House Democrats to add $375 billion to local governments, including cities and counties. There's more support for testing vaccines, etc. So again, the team will be digging a little bit more into the bill and will provide some additional analysis. I do want to mention that this is a negotiation, so we do not expect this to be the final package that Congress comes up with. We have heard from the Senate Republicans that they want to take a slower, more cautious approach, and that they want to look at something maybe around the Memorial Day timeframe. So the road ahead for this package is uncertain, and it could potentially be long, but wanted to just give council an update on some of the recent actions. We will again take a deeper look into the HEROES Act, but we have been hearing that infrastructure and a serious job stimulus and job creation would not be part of this next package. So we anticipate that there will be additional packages in the future that really address that. Finally, at the state level, we expect the governor to release his May revise soon. As you have all heard in the news, the state budget picture is pretty bleak. We've heard different numbers on how bad the budget hole will be. I think a lot of it is due to the uncertainty in the economy. And it's hard to model what that economic recovery might look like at this point. So we've heard numbers as high as $54 billion for the shortfall and as low as $18 billion. So the Assembly budget committees are meeting soon, starting next week, to really talk about adopting what I'm calling a budget of cuts by June 15th. You might remember they had some discussion previously about doing a baseline budget in June. But it's really looking like the Assembly wants to look at what kinds of services they can scale back now to kind of reduce their budget obligations. And then the Senate also just released a proposal this morning with two key packages in it. One is additional renter landlord stabilization. So this would be landlord tax credits and renter relief. And then two, a $25 billion economic recovery fund. So this is an idea of allowing voters to prepay taxes so the state could have some additional revenue and to use that additional revenue now on economic stimulus. So a package of infrastructure, homelessness support, worker retraining types of programs. So I haven't looked at that language yet, but with the Senate Democrats have just released it, we'll be taking a look at that a little bit more. I think it's fair to say that the state is in a very tough financial position this year. It's facing a lot of the declining revenues like the city is as well. So it's most likely that we will be working with them on policy related changes versus additional budget asks at this point. The one exception to that is there's also been some conversations about potential voter bonds that might be going forward in November in response to the pandemic. And we're hearing a lot of things about what might go into that, including climate change, resiliency types of projects, as well as infrastructure projects. So with that, we'll turn it back over to Lee.
Thanks, Benna. This is our last slide. So we will be continuing to evaluate all of the funding options in the coming weeks and better understanding those restrictions. The last thing we want to do is put the council and the city in general in a situation at the end of the year where we owe money back to the federal or state government. We'll be ensuring that we continue our cost tracking mechanisms within the EOC so that we can maximize these reimbursement sources. And then lastly, so that we can align and better operationalize all this work in the context of the city's overall budget, we'll be doing year-end budget transactions that'll be led by Jim Shannon, and this will be focused on replenishing the general fund to the extent possible once we receive FEMA reimbursements into the emergency reserve, and also allocation costs between our coronavirus relief fund, the emergency fund, and any other city funds as appropriate. In the coming weeks, we will be building out that overall source and use to the extent possible, knowing that it will be continuing to evolve as additional guidelines and funding pots come in, but get that to a point where we understand where all those arrows are going. And with that, Dave, I will turn it back over to you. That concludes staff's presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. Thank you to the whole team. So Mayor and Council, we're ready for any questions